the brain and behavior and how the mind works. Before we begin, I'd like to just communicate a bit of information to those of you who have logged into the Zoom room. This presentation will be recorded. Please stay muted. If you haven't used Zoom much or feel uncomfortable, and even if you have, please do not use your videos. Don't share your screen, and try not annotating the presentation. And finally, please don't use the message option in Zoom. Okay, so just to start off, I'll just give a few words about who I am. Just see here. So I studied in Jerusalem, in Israel, and I received my bachelor's quite some time ago in psychology. Then I received a PhD from the United States in 2004. I was in Chicago until 2008. And you can see some of the stations on the left. And since 2008, I'm at the University of Trento in North Italy, where I work at the Center for Mind-Brain Sciences and the Department of Psychology and Cognitive Science. And what I'll be talking about today is how the brain codes, appreciates, or notices just how much uncertainty there is in the external environment. So this question most generally has to do with how do we recognize patterns? How does the mind compute the fact that there is something regular in our external environment that it can actually work with and do something with? And so the first thing that we know is that our minds and our brains are extremely effective in understanding patterns in the environment. And I think we understand that intuitively, but it's really easy to see that when we look at art, at photographs, and at music. So just to start off, I'll give a few examples of works of art that really make salient this property of patterns in the environment. So the first is from the photographer Andreas Gursky, who really has an eye for these sort of patterns expressed in his photographs. This is from Rimini in 2003. We also can appreciate patterns clearly in music. Let me just play some work from Philip Glass. Okay, so basically there are patterns everywhere. We recognize them seemingly automatically, and the question is, how do we do this? So let me just expose the background questions that motivate me and many other people, scientists like me who work in this area. So the first one is, what determines the brain's response to uncertainty? What are those features in the external environment that the brain or the mind is sensitive to? The second question is, are there brain systems that respond differently to different amounts of uncertainty? So are there brain systems that are triggered more strongly or code more strongly or activate more strongly when there is more uncertainty in the environment? And finally, with respect to our brain, is uncertainty one concept? Is it sort of one category? Or are there many different types of uncertainties that the brain is sensitive to? And let me just say one word to preface. So my personal interest coming to this question is more from the perspective of psychology. That means, what can we actually say about the psychological processes, about how the brain computes information and processes it, by looking at patterns of brain activity? And I think this will also come across in this talk. I don't want to start talking about what specific brain areas do, what parts of the brain do what. It's more about what can the brain tell us about the computations that our mind does when it deals with uncertainty. And I think a good starting point is to present two very original and influential thinkers that really talked about uncertainty in a formal way, and to a great extent still conceptualize how we treat and talk about uncertainty today. So the first is Claude Shannon, who's considered the father of information theory. So Claude Shannon was a mathematician, a cryptographer. He worked during World War II. He also worked with Alan Turing. Then he went on and he was a professor at MIT for many years. And he was really one of the founders of the field of information theory, coming up with approaches for precisely describing and quantifying the uncertainty in any sort of given type of communication channel, for example, that of English letters. And so these things are very important, of course, for cryptography. And Claude Shannon presented really pioneering work by now 70 years ago on the amount of uncertainty. He referred to it as entropy, which is the formal term, the amount of uncertainty in an input system. So this work, Prediction and Entropy of Printed English, really began an enormous field of information theory applied to language. And the second very influential thinker is Andrei Markov, who was a Russian mathematician in the late 19th century. And he described mathematical properties of processes that were then named Markov processes, which are processes that generate sequences of events where the next event is only determined by which single event occurred earlier. And he showed that these chains have particular mathematical properties that can be quantified. And with respect to our interest, we can actually look at these chains of events and speak about which of them generates more random or less random, more regular or less regular series. Now, these sort of Markov chains can be used nowadays to describe a very wide variety of processes. We have Markov chains that describe economic processes, like the possibility of moving from a bull market in the stock market to a bear market to a stagnant market. This is a Markov chain describing behavior of a child. A child can be in 3 states: playing, eating, or crying, and it describes the probability of moving from one state to the other. And Markov chains are also applied to language, where they are used to describe the probability of moving from one word to the other as we generate a potential very wide range of sentences. So with those 2 approaches in mind, the one that was developed by Shannon, talking about frequency of events and quantifying them, and the one developed by Markov, we can make this issue of uncertainty a bit more concrete. And I'll be talking about these 2 sorts of uncertainties. And so imagine that you're standing in front of a movie theater and you're seeing people coming out. It's winter, it's North Italy, people are wearing their usual coats, and you see basically somebody exiting with a blue coat, a red coat, a blue coat, a red coat, etc., etc., etc. They're leaving the theater over time, and you're looking at this stream of people leaving, and you see this entire stream, which I read here from left to right, and you think to yourself, I wonder what color of coat would the next person wear. And so this stream of information really has 2 properties. First, it's very easy to see that in terms of the diversity of colors, there are more blue coats than red coats, which is sort of captured here. So looking at the relative proportion of these 2 events, you see that there is more blue than red. And we refer to that as the relative diversity of events. But then there's another property that can be seen here, which is the dependency between occurrences. If you see a blue coat, it's more likely that you'll see another blue coat than a red coat. If you see a red coat, it's more likely that you'll see a blue coat than a red coat, and you're given these transition probabilities here, which describe the event. So diversity and dependency are 2 aspects of regularity that we might actually be sensitive to. And we're going to see, just by looking at these properties, how the brain responds to them and how it codes to them and how they impact our processing. So why should we care about this at all? And I'll tell you the reply from the psychological perspective. So why should we care? Well, first of all, from the perspective of understanding how people learn, appreciating or determining just how much uncertainty there is out there is a very interesting form of learning. Maybe it's one of the most basic forms of learning. Sometimes we call it statistical learning because it's about learning the statistics of the world. And this sort of statistical learning may be really fundamental to how we learn things like language, different skills, how we remember different associations. So understanding the basics of statistical learning is something that psychologists and philosophers are very interested in. Um, More from a psychological and neurobiological perspective, um, understanding how we code uncertainty is very important because our brains don't just process automatically what's coming out from the outside and try to make sense of it or interpret it. Our brains continuously make predictions or anticipate what's going to happen in the future. And our perception of what happens right now is in some sense a combination of this input coming in from our sensory streams and our prior predictions about what is likely to occur in the world. And this integration between what's coming in and what we expected, in some areas of psychology, we call this top down versus bottom up, prediction driven versus feed forward processes. This blending of the two types of information is very important for us to understand. And it's clear that if we understand that the environment is not random, that it has patterns in it, that just lets us make predictions about the world. So really a necessary condition for starting to make predictions about the world is understanding that there's something to predict at all, that there is some sort of regularity that is worth tracking and worth making predictions for. So sensitivity to uncertainty is really sort of the bedrock of many of these processes that we're interested in when it comes to sensory perception in everyday life. So this is why we care. And then we can think about, well, how does the brain or the mind do all of this? How can we actually pick up these patterns and understand that there is something non-random, something interesting and regular in the environment? So how does the brain do it? And this is one area in psychology and neuroscience where we actually have a simple story about how the brain does it. And I think it's interesting because it's probably wrong. And this was by now something like 9, 10 years ago, the reason that I and my research group went into this entire story, because it's very likely not to be the case. But I'll tell you the simple story because it's very easy to remember. And I think it's one of the most intuitive simple stories that are around in psychology. And simple story goes something like this. There's really one sort of uncertainty, and there's one brain system or brain network that is sensitive to it. And so what does this really mean when you think about it? It means that this brain system doesn't care about the physical properties of the input, whether you're hearing something musical from Philip Glass, or you're seeing Gursky's photography, or you're seeing any sort of artwork that unfolds over time, or movies. It doesn't matter. The relative level of uncertainty will be coded in all of these cases by the same brain system. And also something that almost goes without saying is that the brain response would match the strength of uncertainty. The more uncertain things are, the stronger the brain response. Or maybe conversely, the more uncertainty there is, the weaker the brain response is. But it should match the strength of uncertainty in some way, either positively correlated or negatively correlated. And the other thing is that there's one uncertainty in the sense that sensitivity to uncertainty would be independent of how the uncertainty is expressed. So we talked about diversity, that we can impact the relative ratio of one event versus the other. And we talked about transition probabilities in the Markov sense. Well, from this perspective, sensitivity to uncertainty shouldn't really depend on how that uncertainty is expressed or determined. Uncertainty is just that, it's uncertainty, and that's what we're sensitive to. And the last element of the simple story is that if we have a brain system that is sensitive to uncertainty, by definition, it should differentiate regular, predictable contexts from irregular, non-predictable contexts. That is to say, it should track uncertainty in a monotonic way. Finding anything else, and I'll show you that it's actually possible to find quite different patterns, would not fit with the idea that we're sensitive to uncertainty, because how can we be sensitive to uncertainty but not differentiate regular from random contexts. So we'll talk about that a bit in a while. So the approach that we take to all of this is extremely simple. It's pretty much what one would expect. We look in a way inside our brain to study brain activity, to series, to input series that vary in uncertainty. And we use fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging. It's this big magnet here where we can actually put people inside and see which parts of the brain activate to study this question. And those of you who are interested in somewhat more technical information, you can look at this slide. This slide really presents how our data is generated. So we acquire data from the entire brain. This is one slice of the brain. And you can imagine us basically taking data from the entire brain. We actually take data from the entire brain every 2 seconds. But as we go through each slice, and here I've just identified this slice, you can see us taking pictures of this slice over time. Within each slice, we can look at the activity of the brain in many, many different areas. So even within this slice, you see here in this red square, which we call a voxel, we can quantify just how much activity is expressed in that voxel at each and every given time point that we sample it. And that formally gives us what we call a time series. So even from this small voxel in this small slice within the entire brain, we can get to the activity of this voxel over time, which is the intensity of brain activity. And that is a time series that we can look at. And by looking at these time series, we can formally quantify whether this voxel, for example, reacted more strongly or less strongly when inputs were more predictable or less predictable. So this is the very basic principle of how we do our work. Scan the brain, get activity over time, and see whether this activity is sensitive to the different experimental conditions that we use in our study. So here's how we go about asking whether the brain is actually sensitive to the physical properties of the stimuli presented to it. So we're going to study responses to uncertainty, which was expressed via visual or auditory inputs. The approach here is extremely simple, and we take a cue from Markov's approach to regularity. So we use some of the principles that he identified to construct series that vary in regularity. And how do we do this? It's very simple. We use 4 tones or 4 images, and we can create series that are quite predictable by using transitions between them in the following way. So these black lines means that there's a 75% probability, that's a high probability, of moving from this node to this node. And the same from this to this, this to this. And there's a 25% once you're on each of these nodes to repeat and return to the same node. So if you think that these nodes here in the network are, for example, tones like do, re, mi, fa, C, D, E, F in the US tone system, something like this generates quite a regular musical tonal process because the transitions are quite strong, the constraints are strong. And you can contrast this with a system like this, where it doesn't really depend on which of the nodes you are. There's always a 25% probability of either returning to the same node or transitioning to each of the other 3 nodes. So in a system like this, if you take each of these nodes to be a musical tone and you run through it, you actually get what is formally a random series of tones. So using these tools, we can generate tonal series, very simple musical series that can be very, very regular and predictable, completely random, or somewhere in between. And the entire trick is that in one case, we're going to use tones to create musical series, and in the other case, we're going to use shapes to create visual series. And how do we present our findings? We are just going to show brain areas that are sensitive to the different levels of regularity in the inputs for auditory series and visual series. So we present our findings on a picture of a brain. So this here is a picture of a brain. And you see that our brain has this very convoluted pattern. It's not flat. Some areas you can see laterally on the surface, but then it seems like there are these big valleys in between these black lines, which we call sulci. And there's quite a bit of brain area, brain surface area that's hidden inside these sulci. So if you want to understand which brain areas are sensitive to whatever experimental manipulation you do in the world, you have to think about a different way of presenting the data on the brain. And so we do something very simple. Instead of presenting the data on a brain that's presented like this or like this, we use this method of inflating the brain. So something like this becomes something like this, something like this becomes something like this. You can imagine us basically attaching sort of a straw somewhere in the brain and blowing air in to inflate the brain like a balloon. So everything that's inside the sulci basically opens up and is accessible to view. So here, the gyri are in green, and the sulci that were hidden between gyri are right here in red. So it's just a way of presenting the brain so we can see what happens. So here's our first experiment. We present, let me just see here. I see something here has happened. So let me see, we present auditory tones. Or we present, instead of these auditory series, visual series of this sort. Shape on the top, to the right, to the bottom, to the left, to the left, to the top, and we basically get these semi-regular movies that are created according to the principle that I presented before. So again, auditory series, visual series, we construct them so that the auditory series between themselves vary in regularity, the visual series vary in regularity in the exact same way, and we're going to see which parts of the brain are sensitive to them. Okay, I'm going to try to share the screen in a better way. Excuse me for 1 second. And this is what we find. I'm going to present the results first for what we find for the auditory series, and then what we find for the visual series. So everything that you see here in terms of orange and red patches on the brain are brain areas that reacted differently to auditory series depending on how predictable or uncertain those auditory series were. And you can see here, this is actually a brain area that's quite strongly involved in language. A few other brain areas, what they actually do typically is not what this talk is about. But what's very interesting is when you look at the exact same analysis applied to the visual series, you get a completely different set of brain areas. And so what we find is that we have sensitivity to uncertainty, both for auditory series and visual series, but the brain regions that express this sensitivity are completely different. And then we did something that basically expressed the same principle of the study, but looked at a more subtle difference. We looked now only at auditory series, and we manipulated regularity for auditory series. The only thing that we did was that in some cases, we presented auditory series that consisted of very familiar stimuli, which were Italian syllables, often used in speech. And in the other case, instead of Italian syllables, we actually put together streams of music made from bird calls that we found online. So here's what a series of Italian syllables sounds like.
Vo bi vo za za fe vo vo bi bi fe fe za bi fe vo bi 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 vo za bi fe vo za bi vo bi fe fe za za.
And here's a series of bird songs that is equally regular. Okay, so we have auditory series. The only difference is that in one case, they're made of familiar sounds. In the other case, unfamiliar sounds to our participants in North Italy. And what I present here are brain areas that we found that really cared about whether the uncertainty in the series was expressed via Italian syllables or via bird chirps. These aren't brain areas that generally care about whether people are hearing syllables or bird chirps. They don't react differently in terms of amount of activity to these two sorts of stimuli, which are sort of similar, all said with respect to their physical properties. These brain areas care about the fact that the regularity expressed in the series is communicated via syllables or via bird chirps. So, and these are actually areas in the brain that are they perform processes that are very early on in auditory processing. So we see that even when it comes to purely auditory processes, we have parts of the brain that care about whether uncertainty is presented via one auditory form or the other auditory form, meaning that the physical properties of the stimuli, even in cases like this, make a lot of difference with respect to how the brain is coding for uncertainty. So the physical properties matter. Let's move to the other question. Are there actually different sorts of uncertainties when it comes to how the mind and the brain compute them, or is there really only one sort of uncertainty? So here we're going to look at the variance of uncertainty. And just to refresh our memory, we talked about the fact that we can manipulate or control uncertainty by changing diversity, which is the height of these two bar graphs, or we can change diversity by controlling dependency, which is the strength of transition constraints between events. So what we did, we had a study where we manipulated exactly this thing. In some cases, we made things more or less predictable by manipulating diversity. And in another case, we manipulated how things are more or less predictable by manipulating dependency, the strength of the transition constraints between events. And so what we're going to look at brain areas that were sensitive to these manipulations. Which brain areas cared about changes in uncertainty when diversity was manipulated, and which brain areas cared about changes in uncertainty when dependency was manipulated? Are those the same brain areas, or do we have different brain systems? And what we found was that different brain areas tracked uncertainty depending on how uncertainty was expressed. So when we manipulated uncertainty by changing the diversity of the inputs, the relative frequency of the events, we find this system here that is marked in red. These brain areas really care about changes in uncertainty that are impacted by the diversity of the stimuli. But we found these brain areas in yellow, blue, and green that were sensitive to changes in uncertainty, which were a result of manipulating the changes of dependency constraints. And you can see very clearly, you don't need to do much statistical processing here, that these two systems are quite independent of each other. So even when it comes to our brains, it doesn't seem like uncertainty is one uniform, natural kind or concept. There are different types of uncertainties that the brain can track because uncertainty really depends on many different features of the inputs. So this takes us then to the third question in the simple story, which is, does the brain really track just how uncertain things are? Does it always differentiate between regular and random, predictable and non-predictable series? Or does it actually do some computations that are quite different than that? Statistical computations, but very different from what I described. So clearly, when there's more regularity, we can predict the future more strongly. But is that really what the brain codes for? So this takes us a bit into a parallel debate, which actually is a debate in areas of physics and computer science, but we managed to interface with it actually without intending to do so. And the issue is, could it be that our brain tracks uncertainty not so much in order to make predictions about the future, but in order to understand how complicated the environment is? And these two things are not the same thing. So coding for input disorder is important, but also it's important to understand the complexity of the system that generates the input. And there is some very simple formal fact that holds for things that are very predictable, highly ordered, and very random, highly disordered. And what is common to both of these sorts of inputs is that the systems that generate them are very easy to describe. What do I mean? Let's say I have a very predictable, highly ordered musical input consisting of 4 tones. I can just say, to describe it to someone in my family, I can say, I heard this music, it consisted of 4 tones, and each tone could move only to one of the other 4 tones or repeat itself. And that's how the music was generated. So I basically could produce a very short description of the system that generated this music. And if I have a completely random tonal stream, I can say, oh, I was hearing this music. It consisted of 4 tones, and each tone was equally likely to follow any other tone or repeat itself. That's it. I described the entire principle of the system that generates the music. If you actually have tonal streams that are somewhat in between highly ordered and highly disordered, it gets much more difficult to describe those tonal streams. You'd have to tell a story like, oh, I heard this music, it consisted of 4 tones. 2 of the tones could move only to 2 other tones or repeat themselves, whereas the other 2 tones could move to each of the other 3 tones or repeat themselves. And now you're starting to really dig yourself into a hole. So highly ordered and highly disordered inputs are generated by systems that are very easy to describe, whereas other inputs are generated by systems that are much more complicated to describe. And so from a formal perspective, this has really generated or led to 2 views on the relationship between disorder or uncertainty or entropy on the one hand, and the complexity of theories and systems on the other. And this is typically captured by this sort of relation. So the simple view that I was describing until now was one where when you plot the level of disorder against complexity, they're basically the same thing. The more disordered things are, the more complicated they are, and you get this nice straight line. But the other view that I was describing with these examples of music actually suggests that there is this sort of relationship, this inverse U-shaped relationship between disorder and complexity, because when disorder is very low, when things are very predictable, complexity is low. And when things are very random, very disordered, complexity is also low. But when you have inputs with mid-levels of disorder, complexity is highest, is maximum. And so this, from a neurobiological perspective, raises the question, okay, perhaps the brain is sensitive to the statistical properties of the input and its uncertainty, but it's actually not coding for uncertainty. It wants to code for complexity. And so from a formal perspective, what we are interested in is to see whether there are brain areas that show both of these patterns. Are there brain areas that, as you increase disorder, increase or decrease activity in a straight line manner? Or are there brain areas that, as you increase disorder, start increasing, but when disorder increases beyond a certain point, they decrease their activity as well? So we're looking for both of these potential relationships in brain activity. And in fact, when we go and when we look and we search, we just open our eyes and see, do these 2 relationships exist? We actually find very easily that they do. So here in green, we plot brain areas that track disorder in a linear way, that straight line profile that I described before. And here in red, we find brain areas that track disorder, but they respond to it in this inverse U-shaped property that I described before. So all of this is to say that it could be that our brain tracks disorder, but it doesn't necessarily follow disorder with respect to brain activity. In fact, many of these brain regions that I identify here in red showed almost the exact level of brain activity for random and highly ordered series. If you were just to look at random and highly ordered series, you wouldn't find any difference in brain activity in those areas. You'd say, oh, they're just not sensitive to whatever it is being manipulated in the input. But if you look at the activity across many levels of disorder, you see it follows this inverse U-shape. So really, I'm nearing the end of the talk, but with respect to just presenting a coda, I'd like to really question some of the fundamental assumptions that we had until this point. And what I want to question is whether we can actually speak of brain systems or a brain system that tracks uncertainty, or is that actually an error? Is it really a categorical mistake to approach the question in this way? Are we, in a very basic way, ignoring potential massive reorganizations in the brain as a function of uncertainty that makes it really errorful to talk about a brain system or a brain region that tracks uncertainty? And so to give you a feel for why we might think that the entire brain reorganizes when uncertainty changes, I want to show you a bit of data from one of the studies that we did. So in this study, we went voxel by voxel, those tiny squares that I presented earlier, from which we sample brain activity. And we have something like 40,000 voxels that we look at in the brain. And we quantify for each of those 40,000 voxels just how synchronized they are with all the other 40,000 voxels in the brain when people hear the sort of musical streams that we present. So we basically get a measure of correlation between different voxels. How much do they behave in a coordinated way? How coordinated they are when certain musical inputs are presented. And what we find a very stereotypical pattern. We find that as disorder increases, as uncertainty of the musical stream increases, the connectivity of many voxels with the entire brain, with the entire set of voxels in the brain, starts decreasing. So the first thing to really think about is that uncertainty is not just impacting how active a certain brain area is, it's really impacting to what extent it communicates with other brain areas, how correlated it is in a functional sense with other brain areas. So all the brain areas here that you see in all of these different colors, all of them showed a very simple pattern. They were most connected to all the other areas in the brain for highly ordered series, and they were least connected to all the other areas in the brain for random series. So we see here a very basic signature of connectivity, of information transmission in the brain that is impacted by the certainty of the input series. And another thing that we can ask is, well, if we talk about the brain as organized into cliques of brain areas that tend to work together at any given point, is it the case that these cliques, these mini networks within the brain, are they also reorganizing as a function of uncertainty? And so what you see here in this image in different colors are just different cliques in the brain. So here in red are brain areas that tend to form a clique. They tend to correlate with each other, but not with other areas. This is actually the brain's visual cortex. We have here in light brown another clique, in dark brown another clique. So it's very easy to get to these sort of images and see how the brain is organized into different communities or cliques. The important thing for our purposes now is that when we present highly ordered tonal stimuli or random tonal stimuli to participants, and we look at the organization of these cliques in their brains, we find massive reorganization as a function of input uncertainty. And the nature of this reorganization is very simple. And you can sort of see it here. When you present random music, there are many more clicks in the brain. So there are many more separate communities that do their own thing. Whereas when you present highly ordered music, there is much more synchrony between large portions of the brain, and you get a less clickish picture. So these are large scale changes in clustering as a function of input uncertainty. So all of this is to say that perhaps it's just wrong to look at brain activity and particular brain regions and see how their activity changes with uncertainty or predictability. Maybe by doing that, we're actually missing the bigger picture of large-scale reorganization in the brain that is set up to deal with inputs of different uncertainties. If we're just going to look at single brain regions, we're never going to get at the real nature of reorganization. So I think at this point, it will be good to summarize. And so let's take a few steps back and recall the simple story about how the brain and the mind deal with uncertainty. One that says there's one type of uncertainty and one brain system that is insensitive to the physical properties of the input, where the brain response matches the strength of uncertainty, where sensitivity to uncertainty is expressed independent, is presented independently of how uncertainty is expressed, whether it be a auditory or visual, familiar auditory, non-familiar auditory. All this shouldn't really matter, and it really differentiates regular from irregular contexts in a straight, nice, linear fashion. I think our conclusions minimally suggest that much of this is wrong. We find evidence for independent systems that code for uncertainty. We find that different systems actually care about how uncertainty is determined, whether via transition probabilities in the Markov sense or marginal frequencies diversity in the Shannon sense. We find that regularity sensitive systems don't necessarily differentiate random from highly ordered inputs, because the brain seems to care about the complexity of the systems generating the input just as much as it cares about the statistical features of the input itself and its uncertainty. And the code is the last thought that I leave us with, and that sort of impacted me quite a bit, is that perhaps we should look at how uncertainty induces general changes in synchronization across the brain, rather than looking piece by piece at different brain areas, seeing how they change in terms of brain activity. So these are our conclusions to this point. I'd be happy to take questions through the chat or by email if anybody has questions about this. But before I finish, I would want to acknowledge all the people that actually did the work that I advised: Mike Tobia, Mike Andrick, Sam Nastaza, Ben Davis, Sandra Vega Pons, Vittoria Covella, and Pascal Tremblay. If you're interested in getting a bit more of a feel for what it is that we actually did in these studies, these are some studies that report the findings in a more technical and ultimately boring way. I think, and you can email me if you want any of these papers to follow up. Our machines are expensive, and manpower is expensive, and much of this research was funded by European Research Council grant, which we greatly acknowledge. So at this point, I think I will stop monologuing, and I'll see if there are any questions from the people who are here. Okay, so if there are no questions at this point, feel free to email me if anything comes up. And I thank you for your attendance, and have a good day.